Say it again, Ethan Caldwell said, slow and amused, his voice cutting through the low hum of the restaurant like a knife through glass, and the laughter at his table followed on cue, light, effortless, practiced, while Ava Johnson stood beside him in her black uniform, tray balanced in one hand, the faint scent of citrus cleaner still clinging to her sleeves, her posture straight, her face calm, her eyes lowered just enough to avoid inviting more attention but not enough to look small, and when she repeated the order, her voice steady and precise, someone at the table chuckled louder than necessary. Another leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of red wine that caught the warm amber light overhead, and Ethan smirked as if the moment belonged to him entirely, as if the room itself bent slightly in his direction, as if the quiet hierarchy of money and presence and expectation had already decided who mattered and who didn't, and Ava didn't respond, didn't flinch, didn't tighten her grip on the tray even as the edge pressed lightly into her palm, grounding her, reminding her where she stood and why she stayed, because this was the late shift, because rent was due in 3 days, because the soles of her shoes had worn thin from double shifts that stretched past midnight. And still she moved with care, placing each glass exactly where it belonged, aligning silverware with a precision no one noticed until it was missing, until something felt off, and at the edge of the dining room a child dropped a fork with a sharp metallic clatter that echoed just a little too loud, drawing Ava's attention for half a second, just long enough for her to step away, retrieve it, and replace it with a quiet smile that never reached her eyes. And when she returned to Ethan's table, something in the air had shifted, subtle, almost invisible, the kind of shift people feel before they understand it, the kind that makes conversations slow by a fraction, that makes laughter hesitate. On the edge of forming, and Ethan tapped the table once with his finger, impatient, expecting movement, expecting service, expecting control, and Ava stepped forward, not hurried, not hesitant, just precise, her gaze lifting for the first time to meet his, not challenging, not submissive, simply present, and in that brief moment, under the soft glow of overhead lights and the quiet clink of distant glasses, the balance of the room tilted just slightly, though no one could yet say why, and Ava reached for his plate with a calm, measured motion that looked like nothing at all, like routine, like habit, like the invisible work people forget to see. And yet something about the way she did it, the timing, the angle, the quiet certainty in her hands, made the man seated beside Ethan pause mid-sentence, his fork hovering inches above his plate, his eyes narrowing just enough to notice what everyone else had missed, and the laughter at the table thinned, stretched, then faded into a silence so soft it almost went unnoticed, except by those who felt it settle, one breath at a time. The man beside Ethan slowly set his fork down, not with a clatter, not with urgency, but with a quiet precision that felt louder than any noise in the room, his eyes fixed on the plate now inches out of place, and for a moment he said nothing, just stared, as if recalculating something invisible, while Ethan exhaled sharply, annoyed at the sudden break in rhythm, tapping the table again, once, twice, expecting the world to resume its orbit around him, but it did not, because the man leaned closer, his voice low, almost swallowed by the soft jazz drifting through the speakers, and whatever he said did not travel far, yet it landed hard enough to change the air, because Ethan's smirk faltered, just slightly, just enough for the corners of his mouth to hesitate, and his hand, the one resting casually near his glass, stiffened, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that the reflection in the wine trembled under the warm light, and Ava had already stepped back by then, her tray balanced again, her posture unchanged, as if nothing had happened, as if she had only done what she always did, move, adjust, correct, unseen, and yet now every movement felt watched, measured, questioned, the quiet weight of attention shifting toward her like sunlight finding a new surface, and across the table someone cleared their throat, another leaned forward, trying to catch what had been said, but the man did not repeat it. He only glanced at Ava, once, sharp and certain, before looking back at Ethan with a different expression now, one that carried no laughter, no ease, just a thin line of awareness that had not been there before, and Ethan let out a short breath that did not sound like a laugh anymore, more like something caught halfway between disbelief and irritation, and he reached for his glass, took a sip, buying himself a second, then another, but the room did not return to what it was, because once a moment breaks, it does not unbreak, it lingers, stretching quietly between people who suddenly realize they might have missed something important, and Ava turned slightly, just enough to move toward the next table, her steps even, her pace unhurried. But behind her she could feel it, the shift, the silence that followed her instead of the laughter that had preceded her, and near the edge of the dining room the same child she had helped earlier was now watching her, small hands folded near a half-finished plate, eyes wide with a kind of simple curiosity that adults often lose. And for a brief second Ava met that gaze, and something in her expression softened, not weakness, not apology, just a quiet acknowledgement that not every eye in the room carried judgment. And back at Ethan's table the conversation struggled to restart, words overlapping, forced, unnatural, until finally the man beside him spoke again, louder this time, just enough for 2 or 3 others to hear, and heads turned, not sharply, but gradually, like a slow ripple across still water, and Ethan set his glass down, this time more carefully, his fingers lingering against the stem as if grounding himself in something solid. And when he looked up, really looked this time, his eyes found Ava across the room, no longer dismissing, no longer amused, but searching, as if trying to understand how a single, quiet action could have shifted everything without a single raised voice, without a single word of defiance, just precision, timing, and something else he could not yet name. Ethan did not look away this time. Not when Ava moved across the room. Not when another server passed between them carrying a tray of drinks that caught the light like glass flames. Not even when someone at his table tried to restart a conversation about markets and numbers and things that usually held his attention, because something quieter had taken its place, something less comfortable, less certain, and the man beside him leaned in again, this time speaking just loud enough for the table to hear, explaining in measured words what Ava had done, how she had shifted the plate by barely an inch to the left, how that subtle move had avoided something small but costly, something that would have turned into an embarrassment in seconds if left untouched. And as the explanation unfolded, the table fell into a different kind of silence, one that did not belong to power but to realization, and Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not out of anger but out of recognition, because he understood mistakes, he understood risk, and he understood what it meant when someone saw something he had not. And that was the part that unsettled him most. Not that she had acted, but that she had seen, and he had not. And across the room, Ava continued her work, refilling glasses, clearing plates, moving with the same steady rhythm. But now every step seemed to echo a little louder. Every motion carried a weight it had not carried before, because eyes followed her, not all of them, not openly, but enough to change the shape of the room. And near the bar a couple paused mid-conversation, glancing in her direction, unsure why, just feeling the shift ripple outward, and the child at the edge of the dining room smiled faintly, as if sensing something simple and true beneath the complexity of adult reactions. And back at the table Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier amusement, asking a question that no one answered immediately, because the answer sat across the room in a black uniform with worn shoes and steady hands. And for the first time that night, the space between who he was and who she appeared to be did not feel as wide as it had just minutes ago. And that realization lingered, quiet and persistent, like a note that refuses to fade. The question lingered at the table longer than anyone expected, not because it was difficult, but because no one wanted to say it out loud first. And Ethan felt that hesitation like a quiet resistance pressing against his usual certainty. So he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift his weight and draw a few glances from nearby tables, and the chair legs brushed softly against the floor as he stepped away, leaving behind half-finished conversations and untouched glasses, his eyes fixed now on Ava as she moved between tables with the same measured calm, unaware, or perhaps simply unbothered by the change behind her. And when he reached her, he did not speak immediately, the words catching somewhere between pride and curiosity, because asking meant admitting, even if only to himself, that something had slipped past him, and Ava turned toward him before he said anything. As if she had sensed the approach not by sound but by presence, her expression neutral, professional, steady, and for a second neither of them moved. The space between them filled with the low hum of the restaurant and the faint clink of dishes from the kitchen. And then Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of the edge it had carried earlier, asking what she had done, not accusing, not mocking, just asking. And Ava did not answer right away, not out of hesitation, but out of habit, because people like him did not usually ask. They told, they expected, they moved on. And she met his gaze for a brief moment before looking at the table behind him. The plate, the placement, the angle, and she explained in simple terms, clear and precise, how the dish had been set incorrectly, how a small detail could have caused an issue within seconds, how she adjusted it without interrupting the flow of service. Her tone even, almost quiet, as if the explanation mattered less than the fact that it had already been handled. And Ethan listened, really listened, not to the words alone but to the certainty behind them, the absence of performance, the lack of need to impress. And that unsettled him more than anything else, because there was no attempt to prove herself, no effort to claim credit, just a calm statement of what was and what had been done. And around them the room seemed to hold its breath again, not frozen like before, but attentive, aware of something shifting that no one could quite name. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if processing more than he was willing to show. And when he stepped back, it was not with dismissal, not with authority, but with something closer to recognition. And Ava returned to her work without another word, without waiting for acknowledgement, her steps steady, her hands precise. And behind her the table he had left sat quieter now, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by something heavier, something reflective. And as Ethan walked back, the man beside him watched with a knowing look, not triumphant, not smug, just certain. And Ethan sat down differently this time, not leaning back, not claiming space, but sitting still, his fingers resting lightly on the table as his gaze drifted once more across the room, following Ava's movement with a focus that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with understanding. And for the first time that night, he realized that the smallest actions, the ones no one applauds, the ones no one even notices, can carry a kind of power that does not announce itself, does not demand attention, but changes everything the moment it is seen. The rhythm of the restaurant returned, but not the same as before, softer somehow, as if every sound had learned to stay just a little more careful. And Ethan noticed it in the way conversations no longer rose above a certain level, in the way laughter came slower, more measured. And he sat there with his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, not reaching for his phone, not checking the time, just watching as Ava moved again through the room, her presence no longer invisible, no longer background, but something quietly central. And he found himself replaying the moment in his head, the angle of the plate, the timing, the certainty in her explanation, and more than that, the fact that she had acted without hesitation, without recognition, without any need to be seen. And that unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss, because everything in his world had always been about visibility, about control, about being the one who noticed first, decided first, spoke first. And yet here, in a place he thought he understood completely, someone had moved before him, seen before him, corrected something before it became a problem, and then stepped away as if it did not matter. And the man beside him leaned back slightly, watching Ethan with a quiet expression, not pushing, not commenting, just observing the shift as it settled in. And across the room, Ava paused briefly near the service station, adjusting a stack of plates with the same careful alignment, her fingers moving with practiced precision. And for a moment she allowed herself a breath, a small one, almost invisible, before stepping back in motion. And near the edge of the dining room the child waved at her again, a small gesture, unnoticed by most, but Ava saw it. And this time her lips curved into the faintest smile, not wide, not lingering, just enough to acknowledge something simple and real. And when she turned, she caught Ethan looking at her again, not with the same gaze as before, not dismissive, not amused, but searching. And she did not hold it, did not challenge it. She simply moved on, because there were other tables, other orders, other details that needed her attention. And the work did not pause for reflection, even if the room had. And Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back now, but not in the same way, not claiming space, just settling into it. And he realized something then. something that did not arrive with force, but with quiet clarity. That power was not always loud, not always visible, not always announced. Sometimes it moved in silence, in small corrections, in unseen decisions that prevented larger failures. And it did not need recognition to exist. And that thought stayed with him as the evening continued, as plates were cleared and replaced, as conversations resumed in softer tones. And when the check finally arrived, he did not reach for it immediately, not out of hesitation, but because he was still watching, still thinking, still trying to understand how something so small had shifted the entire room without anyone realizing it until it was already done. The check sat untouched at the edge of the table longer than it should have, the small leather folder catching the soft overhead light, while conversations around it faded into a distant hum, and Ethan's fingers hovered just above it before pulling back, not out of indecision, but because his attention had already moved elsewhere again. Tracking Ava as she crossed from one side of the dining room to the other, her steps measured, her pace steady, and there was something almost rhythmic about it. Now, something intentional in the way she navigated the space, anticipating movement before it happened, adjusting without pause, like she was reading a pattern no one else could see. And the man beside him noticed it too, leaning slightly forward, his gaze following the same path, not with surprise anymore, but with quiet respect. And at the far end of the room, a server nearly collided with a guest stepping back from their chair, but Ava was already there, shifting the tray just enough, guiding the movement with a subtle turn of her wrist that kept everything balanced, everything intact, and the moment passed without disruption, without attention, except for those who had started to watch her more closely, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper now, not as a sudden shock, but as something unfolding piece by piece. And he finally reached for the check, opening it with a calm motion, his eyes scanning the total without really seeing it, because numbers had never required effort from him. They had always aligned, always obeyed. But this was different. This was not about control or calculation. This was about something quieter, something that did not announce itself. And when he placed his card inside, he paused, just for a second, then looked up again, his gaze searching for Ava, not out of habit, not out of expectation, but because something in him needed to understand more. And across the room, she paused near the service station again, speaking briefly with another server, her tone low, her gestures minimal, and even in conversation, she carried that same calm precision, that same absence of excess. And when she turned, their eyes met once more, and this time she did not look away immediately, not because she was challenging him, but because there was no reason to, no hierarchy in that moment, just two people aware of each other in a space that had shifted around them. And Ethan gave a small nod, almost instinctive, not a command, not a signal, just an acknowledgement, and Ava returned it just as simply, before moving on, because the work continued, always continued. And as the server came to collect the check, glancing down briefly at the card inside, there was a flicker of surprise, quickly hidden, as she processed what had been left. And Ethan stood then, not hurried, not delayed, just moving with a different kind of awareness, his chair sliding back softly. And as he stepped away from the table, the room did not react the way it might have earlier. There was no shift toward him, no pull of attention, because it had already moved, already settled somewhere else. And he walked toward the exit with a steady pace, passing by Ava once more without stopping, without speaking. But the moment lingered between them anyway, unspoken, understood. And as the door opened and the cooler night air slipped in, brushing against the warmth of the dining room, Ethan paused just outside, his hand resting lightly against the doorframe, his mind replaying the evening not as a sequence of events, but as a series of small, precise moments that had quietly rewritten something he had not realized needed changing. And behind him, inside, Ava picked up another tray, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged, already moving into the next moment as if the last had never happened. And yet everything had. The night air lingered on Ethan's skin longer than it should have, cool and steady, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint echo of the restaurant behind him. And for a moment he did not move, his hand still resting against the doorframe, as if stepping away meant leaving something unfinished, something not yet fully understood. And inside the rhythm continued without him, plates shifting, voices blending, footsteps crossing paths and patterns that no longer included his presence. And that absence felt unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, just different. And he finally stepped forward, the door closing softly behind him, the sound barely noticeable, yet final in a way that settled quietly in his chest. And as he walked down the sidewalk, the city stretched out in its usual rhythm, headlights passing in slow lines, people moving with purpose, conversations drifting in fragments, but his mind stayed behind, replaying the precision of a movement that had taken less than a second and somehow changed the weight of an entire room. And he reached the edge of the curb, pausing again as a car passed, the reflection of its lights sliding across the glass windows of the restaurant behind him, and for a brief second he saw inside again, not clearly, just enough to catch the motion of Ava moving between tables, steady as ever, already part of a moment that had moved on without needing him to stay. And he exhaled slowly, stepping off the curb as the light changed, his pace measured. Not rushed, not delayed, just moving. And back inside, Ava adjusted the strap of her apron, shifting the weight slightly against her side before picking up another order, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the ticket as she scanned it, committing each detail to memory without effort. And the server beside her leaned in, whispering something about the table that had just left, a quiet mention of the tip, the kind of number that did not go unnoticed even in a place like this. And Ava nodded once, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging it before moving on, because numbers came and went, but the work remained, always remained. And as she stepped back onto the floor, the room felt different in a way she could not fully explain, not quieter, not louder, just more aware, as if something had shifted beneath the surface and left a trace behind. And near the edge of the dining room, the child was gone now. The table cleared, the chairs pushed in neatly, the small moment that had existed there already erased by the next wave of guests. And Ava moved past it without pause, her steps steady, her focus forward. And outside, Ethan reached his car, but did not open the door immediately, his hand hovering near the handle as his gaze drifted upward, reflecting faintly in the dark window. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something he could not measure, could not calculate, something that did not fit into the patterns he had built his life around. And it was not discomfort, not regret, just a quiet question that had not yet found its answer. And inside the restaurant, Ava placed another plate down with the same careful precision, aligning it just slightly before stepping back, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. And though the moment had passed, though the room had moved on, something of it remained, not visible, not spoken, just there, woven into the rhythm of everything that followed. The engine started, but Ethan did not drive right away, his hands resting on the steering wheel as the dashboard lights cast a soft glow across his face, steady and controlled. Yet his thoughts were not. They moved back to the restaurant, to the quiet shift that had followed something so small it should have been forgettable. And yet it was not. It stayed, looping, replaying, not the laughter, not the table, but the moment before the change. The exact second when everything tilted and he had not seen it coming. And that absence of awareness unsettled him more than anything else, because he had built his life on seeing first, acting first, staying ahead. And tonight, someone else had done that without effort, without recognition, without even pausing. And inside the restaurant, Ava moved through the final stretch of the evening, the crowd thinning, the noise softening into something slower, more deliberate, chairs being adjusted, glasses collected, the rhythm easing into its closing pace. And she continued as she always did, not rushing, not slowing, just steady, her hands moving with the same quiet certainty, stacking plates, aligning edges, wiping surfaces until they reflected the warm overhead lights. And near the service station, one of the newer servers watched her for a moment longer than usual, trying to follow the pattern, the timing, the way she anticipated movement before it happened. But it was not something easily explained. It was not a trick or a method. It was awareness, built over time, shaped by necessity, refined by repetition. And Ava did not notice the observation, or if she did not react, because attention had never been the point. And across the room, the manager stepped out from the office, scanning the floor with a practiced eye, nodding once at the state of things, the quiet efficiency, the absence of issues. And when his gaze passed over Ava, it lingered for half a second, not in surprise, but in recognition of something he had learned not to question, because some people simply carried a level of control that did not need explanation. And outside, Ethan finally shifted the car into motion, pulling away from the curb with a smooth turn, the city lights stretching ahead in long lines, and he drove without turning on the radio, without checking his phone. Just the low hum of the engine filling the space as his mind continued to circle the same question, not what she had done, but how she had seen it, how she had known, and why it had mattered enough for her to act without hesitation, without reward. And the thought stayed with him as he stopped at a red light, the glow reflecting off the windshield, and he caught his own reflection faintly in the glass, not the version others saw, not the one built on certainty and control, but something quieter, something less defined. And inside the restaurant, Ava carried the last tray of the night back to the kitchen, setting it down with the same careful precision, the sound soft, controlled, final. And as she wiped her hands against a clean towel, she paused for just a second, not in thought, not in reflection, just a breath, small and steady, before stepping back out, ready for whatever came next, as if nothing had changed. And yet everything had shifted in ways neither of them could fully see yet. The last guests filtered out slowly, coats draped over arms, quiet conversations trailing behind them as the door opened and closed in soft intervals. And the restaurant settled into that final stretch where everything felt lighter but more exposed, where every sound carried just a little farther, and Ava moved through it with the same steady rhythm, collecting the last glasses, stacking the final plates, her hands working without pause, without wasted motion. And near the service station, the other servers gathered in small clusters, voices lower now, sharing fragments of the night. But every so often their eyes drifted toward her, not openly, not in a way that called attention, just a quiet acknowledgement of something they had all felt but had not yet put into words. And Ava did not join them, not out of distance, just because her work was not done, and she wiped down the edge of a table, aligning the chairs one by one until they sat perfectly parallel, the lines clean, the space reset. And in the office, the manager reviewed the night's reports, numbers scrolling across the screen, totals and percentages and patterns he knew by memory. And something stood out, not immediately obvious, but enough to make him pause. The absence of a problem that should have appeared, the kind of small disruption that usually showed up in the numbers before anyone noticed it on the floor. And he leaned back slightly, thinking through the sequence, retracing the flow of service, and his mind stopped at the same moment everyone else had felt, but not fully understood, the second when everything had shifted and then corrected itself without interruption. And he glanced up through the glass, his eyes landing on Ava as she moved past the last table. And he did not call her in, did not ask, because he already knew the answer would be simple, precise, and offered without expectation. And across the city, Ethan slowed as he approached another red light, the glow washing over the interior of the car. And he realized he had not turned on the radio the entire drive, had not reached for his phone, had not checked a single message. And that alone felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable, just different. And his thoughts returned again, not to the moment itself, but to what it revealed, the gap between noticing and missing, the difference between reacting and understanding. And he found himself questioning something he had never needed to question before, not his success, not his control, but the foundation beneath it, the assumption that awareness always came with position, that seeing came with authority, and tonight had quietly proven otherwise. And inside the restaurant, Ava carried the last stack of menus back to their place, aligning them neatly, the edges flush, the corners squared, and she stepped back, looking over the room one final time, not searching, not judging, just confirming that everything was in order. And for a brief second she stood still, her reflection faint in the glass of the front window, the city lights beyond it flickering softly. And then she turned, reaching for her bag, her shift complete, her presence already beginning to fade into the next moment, the next place. The next quiet action that would go unnoticed by most, but not by everyone, not anymore. The door clicked softly behind Ava as she stepped out into the night, the cool air brushing against her face, carrying away the warmth and noise of the restaurant in a single quiet breath. And for a moment she stood there, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her body still holding the rhythm of the shift, The invisible timing that did not stop just because the doors had closed, and the street stretched ahead under dim lights. Cars passing in steady lines, footsteps echoing faintly along the sidewalk, and she began to walk, her pace unhurried, her steps measured the same way they had been inside, as if the world itself moved on patterns she had learned to read without thinking. And behind her, through the glass, the manager remained in his office, still looking at the numbers, still tracing the absence of a mistake that should have been there. And something about it did not sit right with him, not because it was wrong, but because it was too clean, too precise. And he stood, stepping out onto the floor one last time, his eyes scanning the room that now sat empty, every table aligned, every surface reset, and he paused near the spot where Ethan had been seated earlier, his gaze lowering to the table, the angle, the placement, and for a brief second he saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to understand that something had been corrected before it ever became visible, and he exhaled slowly, nodding once to himself, as if confirming something he had always known but rarely acknowledged. And across town Ethan pulled into his driveway, the car rolling to a smooth stop, the engine idling for a second longer before he turned it off, and the silence that followed was immediate, complete, and he remained there, hands resting lightly on the wheel, staring ahead without really seeing anything, because his thoughts had not caught up yet. They were still back in that moment, that single second where everything shifted without announcement, and he stepped out of the car, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound, and as he walked toward the entrance of his home, the lights inside turned on automatically, bright, polished, precise, everything exactly where it should be, and yet something felt different, not in the space, but in him, something subtle, something that did not demand attention but refused to be ignored, and he loosened his tie as he stepped inside, placing his keys on the counter with a quiet click, and for the first time that night, the question formed clearly, not what had happened, but why it had stayed with him, why something so small had carried so much weight. And across the city Ava reached the bus stop, the metal bench cool beneath her as she sat, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her shoulders relaxing just slightly now that the shift was over, and she watched the street ahead without focus, not thinking about the night, not replaying it, because for her it had already passed, just another series of moments handled, corrected, completed, and the bus lights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached, and she stood as it slowed, the doors opening with a soft hiss. And she stepped inside without hesitation, moving toward an empty seat by the window, her reflection faint in the glass as the city began to move again outside. And somewhere between those two places, between the quiet house and the moving bus, something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to shift the direction of what would come next. The bus moved steadily through the night, each stop marked by a soft hiss of doors and the quiet shuffle of passengers coming and going. And Ava sat by the window with her hands resting loosely in her lap, her reflection faint against the passing streetlights, her posture finally relaxed but not slouched, still carrying that same quiet control even in stillness. And outside the city blurred into lines of light and shadow, storefronts closing, traffic thinning, the world shifting into a slower rhythm that matched the pace of her breathing. And she did not replay the night, did not analyze the moment that had drawn attention, because for her it had never been about attention, it had been about correction, about doing what needed to be done before it became something else, something larger. And that instinct had been built long before the restaurant, long before the uniform, shaped by years of noticing what others overlooked, of stepping in quietly where gaps appeared, and across town. Ethan stood in his kitchen, the polished surfaces reflecting the overhead lights with perfect clarity, everything in place, everything controlled, and yet he had not moved from where he stood, his jacket draped over the back of a chair, his tie loosened but still hanging, his gaze unfocused as if the room around him had become secondary to something unfolding internally. And he walked slowly to the counter, placing both hands against the cool surface, grounding himself in something physical, something real. And he thought about the moment again, not as an event, but as a decision, the exact second where Ava had chosen to act, not because she was asked, not because she was seen, but because it was the right thing to do. And that distinction settled heavily, because it was not something he could quantify, not something he could replicate through instruction or control. And it forced him to confront something he had not considered before, the idea that awareness did not belong to position, that clarity did not require authority, and that realization did not come with comfort, but with a quiet shift in perspective that could not be undone. And back on the bus, Ava adjusted slightly in her seat as it turned onto a quieter street, the motion gentle, almost lulling, and she glanced briefly at the other passengers, a man asleep near the back, a woman scrolling through her phone, a student staring out the opposite window, each of them in their own world, unaware of the small shifts happening in others, unaware of the invisible threads that connected moments across distance. And when the bus slowed at her stop, she stood without hesitation, moving toward the door with the same steady rhythm, stepping down onto the sidewalk as it pulled away behind her, the sound fading quickly into the distance. And she walked the remaining block to her apartment building, the lights dim, the hallway quiet, her key turning softly in the lock as she stepped inside. And for a brief second she paused, the silence settling around her, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the night finally came to rest. And across the city, Ethan remained where he stood, his reflection faint in the polished surface before him, not searching for answers, not forcing conclusions, just allowing the question to remain. Because for the first time in a long while, he understood that not every answer came from control, and not every shift announced itself when it began. Morning arrived without urgency, the light slipping through Ethan's windows in thin, quiet lines that stretched across the polished floor. And for a moment he stood there again, not moving, not reaching for his phone, not stepping into the routine that usually defined his mornings, because something from the night before had not settled. It had carried over, subtle but present, like a thought waiting to be acknowledged. And he poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising in slow curls, the scent filling the space, grounding him in something simple, something familiar, and yet even that felt different, as if the smallest details now carried more weight than before. And he leaned lightly against the counter, staring out at the city below, watching as it came to life in steady patterns, cars moving, people crossing streets, everything aligned, everything predictable. And still, his mind returned to the same question. Not what she had done, but why it had stayed with him, why it had mattered. And across town, Ava woke to a quieter morning, the soft hum of the building, the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway, and she moved through her routine with the same calm precision, preparing for another day, another shift, another series of moments that would require the same awareness, the same quiet attention to detail. And she stepped out into the morning light, the air cooler now, the city already in motion, and she blended into it. Without effort, just another figure moving through the rhythm, unnoticed, unremarkable, and yet carrying something that did not need to be seen to exist. And back in his kitchen, Ethan set his cup down, the sound soft against the surface, and made a decision, not impulsive, not driven by emotion, but deliberate, quiet. And he reached for his phone, scrolling briefly before stopping, his thumb hovering for a second before he made the call, his voice steady when it connected, asking a simple question, the name of the restaurant, the schedule, nothing more, no explanation, no urgency, just a request for information. And when he ended the call, he stood there for a moment longer, the silence returning, but not empty, not uncertain, just open, as if something had shifted direction without needing to announce itself. And across the city, Ava stepped onto the bus again, taking her usual seat by the window, the city passing by in familiar patterns, and she did not know that anything had changed beyond the walls of the restaurant, did not expect anything to, because for her, the work remained the same, the rhythm unchanged, the quiet actions continuing as they always had. And yet somewhere between those two places, between intention and routine, something was already beginning to move toward its next moment. The restaurant opened again with the same quiet rhythm, the same soft lighting, the same polished surfaces reflecting a world that looked unchanged from the night before. And Ava stepped onto the floor with her apron tied, her shoes worn in the same places, her posture steady, her presence as quiet as ever. And for a while nothing felt different. Orders came in, glasses were filled, plates were placed with the same precision that no one noticed until it was missing, and the room moved as it always did, unaware of the small shift that had already begun beyond its walls. And then the door opened, not loudly, not dramatically, just a simple motion. But this time the air carried something else with it, something familiar, something that did not belong to the usual flow of guests, and Ethan stepped inside, his pace measured, his expression calm, not the same as before, not carrying the easy confidence that had filled the space around him the night before, but something quieter, something more aware, and he did not look around for attention, did not wait for recognition. He simply moved toward a table, taking a seat without announcement. And for a moment no one reacted, because there was nothing to react to, just another guest in a room that did not pause for individuals. And Ava saw him only after a few seconds, not immediately, not dramatically, just in the natural sweep of her attention across the floor. And when she did not stop, did not change her pace. She simply adjusted her path, moving toward his table with the same steady rhythm, her tray balanced, her expression neutral. And when she reached him, there was no tension, no echo of the night before, just a quiet stillness that settled between them. And Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze without the edge he had carried before, without the assumption that had shaped his presence. And for a second neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be said to acknowledge what had already been understood. And then he ordered, his voice even, his tone respectful, not exaggerated, not performative, just different in a way that did not need explanation. And Ava nodded once, writing it down with the same precise motion, her hand steady, her focus clear. And when she turned to leave, he spoke again, not loudly, not to draw attention, just enough for her to hear, a simple statement, not an apology, not a correction, just recognition. And Ava paused for a fraction of a second, not surprised, not affected, just acknowledging it with the slightest shift in her expression, something soft, something real, before continuing on, because the work did not stop, the rhythm did not change. And as the evening unfolded, the room remained the same on the surface, conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking, light reflecting off polished wood, but beneath it something had shifted. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that stayed. And when Ava placed his plate down later, aligning it with the same careful precision, Ethan noticed, not because it was different, but because he was, and he did not speak, did not interrupt, he simply watched, understanding now that the smallest actions, the quiet ones, the ones done without expectation, carried a kind of power that did not need to be seen to matter. And Ava moved on, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, not seeking recognition, not needing it. And the moment passed without announcement, without applause, just a quiet exchange of awareness that did not belong to the room, but to something deeper, something that did not end when the night did, something that continued, unseen, in the spaces between what people noticed and what they chose to understand.